They feared China. They feared Russia. But what terrifies them most is an Africa that dares to stand united. Not with tanks, not with missiles, but with ideas, with dignity, with unity. Today, tremors shake the corridors of Western power, not from Beijing's mega-projects, nor Moscow's maneuvers, but from Ouagadougou, from Bamako, from Niamey, where a new generation of leaders and citizens refuse to kneel, where words like sovereignty, self-reliance, and dignity are no longer slogans, but policies. Africa holds 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet imports food worth $60 billion a year. It owns 30% of global mineral reserves, yet remains at the bottom of the GDP ladder. These aren't quirks of history. They are engineered imbalances, and the men and women who dare to rebalance them are now labeled radicals. When Ibrahim Traoré expelled foreign troops and declared that Burkinabe gold would be processed on Burkinabe soil, he wasn't just reclaiming national pride. He was issuing a warning. Africa is done exporting hope. It's ready to harvest power. If you feel the weight of this moment, do not scroll. Subscribe and witness a transformation history will not forget. No treaties were burned. No bombs dropped. Yet in early 2023, the world watched as Burkina Faso, a landlocked country often forgotten on Western maps, quietly ignited the most potent rebellion of the 21st century. The spark? A 30-something captain named Ibrahim Traoré, who stood before his people not to plead for aid, but to declare ownership. When Traoré announced the expulsion of French troops from Burkinabe soil, the world barely blinked. After all, it wasn't the first time a post-colonial nation demanded autonomy, but this time, it wasn't merely political theater. This was structural. Within weeks, his administration began renegotiating mining contracts, targeting the gold sector that had for decades enriched foreign corporations, while local communities bore the scars of extraction. He demanded that gold be processed within the country, not shipped out in raw form to be refined abroad. "Our soil is not a sieve," one official reportedly said. "It is the womb of our future." These weren't just policy shifts. They were metaphors incarnate. A continent long treated as a quarry was now speaking as a cultivator. But Traoré did not stop there. He reached eastward, toward Russia, signing agreements focused not on charity or military bases, but on technology transfers and agricultural development. In doing so, he sent a message that echoed beyond borders. Partnerships must serve Africa first, not funders. It was the boldest assertion of Burkinabe sovereignty since the days of Thomas Sankara, the iconic leader who, in 4 short years, achieved food self-sufficiency, launched a mass vaccination campaign, and planted 10 million trees. Sankara, too, had rejected aid with strings attached. He paid the price with his life. But this time, the seeds of sovereignty had landed on soil no longer silent. Across West Africa, similar voices rose. In Mali, in Niger, the pattern was unmistakable, and to some, unbearable. To Western observers, it seemed like a string of unfortunate coups. But to many Africans, especially the youth, it felt like a correction, a recalibration of independence that had for too long remained theoretical. The stakes became even clearer when Traoré's government revoked accords that allowed French military flights in Burkinabe airspace without prior approval, a small act with vast symbolism. Burkina Faso was not merely rejecting neocolonial presence. It was rewriting the terms of engagement. And then came the symbol of symbols, the reclaiming of gold. Not just as a resource, but as metaphor. Gold had long represented Africa's curse, beautiful, bountiful, and bleeding. To refine it on Burkinabe soil was to say, the curse ends here. Traoré's boldness drew inevitable comparisons to Sankara, but the echoes went further. To Lumumba, who had dared demand Congolese control over Congolese copper. To Gaddafi, whose plan for a gold-backed African currency may have sealed Libya's fate. To Nkrumah, who dreamed of a United States of Africa. History had often punished such dreams, and yet here it was again. Not just in speeches, but in legislation. Not just in ideals, but in implementation. A generation had arisen not merely to resist, but to reimagine. The Western response? Predictable. Concerns over stability. Warnings of foreign interference. But beneath the diplomatic phrasing, one truth lingered unspoken. Fear. Not of chaos, but of clarity. The clarity of a nation discovering that it does not need to be supervised to be sovereign. This is not a movement led by generals seeking glory. It is a moment forged by citizens demanding dignity. Traoré's government did not cut ties with Europe entirely. It simply redefined them, no longer as a subordinate, but as an equal, or nothing at all. One must ask, what makes this different? Coups are not new. Sovereignty speeches are not rare. What sets this apart? It's the foundation. Because for the first time in decades, a leader is not only breaking the chains, but showing how to melt them into tools. But is this a solo act, or the spark of a continental fire? The air was thick in Ouagadougou, not with smoke, but with certainty. As the tricolor flag of France was lowered over military compounds once considered untouchable, thousands poured into the streets not in protest, but in celebration. Drums echoed through the city. Mothers ululated. Young men waved Burkinabe flags high above crowds, their voices hoarse from chanting, La patrie ou la mort. Western headlines called it instability, but on the ground it felt like awakening. This wasn't a coup celebrated for chaos. It was sovereignty cheered for clarity. Across Africa, images of Ibrahim Traoré addressing his people, calm, unshaken, resolute, circulated on social media like wildfire. No teleprompters, no rehearsed diplomacy. Just a soldier-turned-statesman speaking directly to the youth, to the farmers, to the forgotten. He spoke of ownership, of dignity, of a new path. And the people listened, not out of obligation, but belief. The Western response was swift and telling. Diplomatic cables leaked concern over Burkina Faso's tilt toward Russia. Editorials warned of growing influence from malign actors. Anonymous officials expressed fears about governance deterioration. But what went largely unmentioned? The crowds in the streets. The posters bearing Sankara's face beside Traoré's. The chants not of war, but of self-reliance. This was not the frenzy of manipulated masses. It was the clarity of a people long unheard, now finally seeing their reflection in power. In Mali and Niger, similar celebrations erupted when military-led transitions echoed Traoré's rhetoric. Flags changed, but the messages remained. We are not your client states. We are sovereign lands, and we will be treated as such. Western media struggled to frame this. They knew the tropes: strong man, proxy, authoritarian populist. But the facts didn't fit neatly. Traoré was not enriching himself. He did not imprison opposition leaders en masse. He was not begging for debt relief while buying private jets. He was, by all visible measures, living modestly and acting decisively. And so came the pivot: blame the Russians. Almost overnight, headlines began shifting. Burkina Faso under Russian influence. Wagner shadow looms. Moscow's new empire in Africa. Never mind that Traoré's stated policies preceded any formal engagement. Never mind that many African governments had courted Moscow for decades. The story needed a villain, and sovereignty alone didn't make a good antagonist. It was information warfare by omission. Consider this. When President Patrice Lumumba of Congo attempted to assert control over the country's resources, he was labeled a threat and assassinated. When Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency, Libya was bombed into disintegration. When Thomas Sankara rejected IMF loans, he was eliminated with Western complicity. And now, as Traoré redraws the map of dependency, the same whispers echo, just with new branding. But here's what they cannot spin. The streets. Footage of Burkinabe youth painting over French signs. Women dancing in marketplaces where foreign troops once patrolled. Villagers speaking on camera, not in anger, but in hope. In one viral clip, a teenager holds a cardboard sign. No more masters, only neighbors. No scriptwriter in Washington could manufacture that. This resonance across the continent is what truly unsettles foreign strategists, because it is not rooted in ideology. It is born of lived experience. For decades, aid agencies promised roads. China built them. Western diplomats pledged power stations. Russia helped fund them. The youth are connecting the dots and drawing their own maps. And so the question grows louder. Why is sovereignty suspicious only when African hands hold it? The media's double standard is impossible to ignore. African leaders who serve Western interests, regardless of corruption, repression, or incompetence, are hailed as stabilizing forces. Those who serve African interests are condemned as threats to regional order. One analyst on a major Western network even suggested that Burkina Faso was too unstable for full autonomy, a phrase that could have been lifted straight from colonial archives. But Traoré's supporters are not fooled. They do not need permission to dream. They need space to build. And this is where this ground truly shakes, not beneath embassies or military outposts, but beneath assumptions. The assumption that African anger can always be redirected, that African youth can be distracted, that African revolutions must be loud, violent, and doomed. This one is different. It is quiet, organized, digital, determined, because sovereignty, once seen, cannot be unseen. If one landlocked nation can rise, who's next? Burkina Faso did not collapse. Contrary to the forecasts of foreign policy pundits and the cautious warnings from international think tanks, the country did not descend into chaos after severing military ties with France and restructuring its extractive economy. Instead, something unexpected happened. The streets grew calmer. Local councils, once paralyzed by dependency on foreign development agencies, began meeting with renewed urgency. University students who had long memorized IMF policy jargon now debated agro-industrial self-sufficiency. Civil society organizations rewrote their charters, from donor-driven objectives to sovereignty-centered missions. The psychological shift was seismic. For decades, foreign aid had filled the vacuum left by gutted institutions. Now the vacuum was filled by will. In the short term, yes, there were losses. Development aid from France was suspended. Certain EU programs paused their funding. Economic forecasts from Western banks grew grim. Some investors pulled out, citing uncertainty, the preferred euphemism for a government that insists on fairer deals. But the anticipated collapse never came. Why? Because Burkina Faso, like much of Africa, had long been surviving despite the system, not because of it. The suspension of aid revealed a startling truth. The national budget was already heavily reliant on domestic revenues. Gold exports, when properly taxed and managed, could substitute for large portions of lost grants. Trade diversification, especially with Turkey, Brazil, and Russia, began to bear fruit. And diaspora remittances, long under-leveraged, surged as Burkinabe abroad responded to the new spirit of nation-building. The social fabric responded in kind. There was a visible uptick in local enterprise. Farmers in Koudougou and Bobo Dioulasso reported greater access to microloans from newly capitalized national banks. Youth in Ouagadougou formed cooperatives to manufacture school supplies that were once imported from France. Even rural radio stations pivoted, dropping development agency programming in favor of locally produced shows on civic rights and Pan-African history. This was not utopia. The challenges remained vast. Insecurity in the north, infrastructure gaps, health system limitations. But the national mood had shifted from resignation to resolve. The most significant shift? Public trust. For the first time in years, the government was not viewed as an intermediary for foreign interests, but as an expression of domestic will. That shift in perception alone created space for reform that decades of donor workshops could not achieve. And this resonance didn't stop at Burkina Faso's borders. In Bamako, similar policies gained traction. In Niamey, citizens debated nationalizing certain sectors. Across Francophone Africa, the question was no longer whispered, but spoken aloud. What if we stopped asking for permission? This is not just about Burkina Faso. It's the blueprint of an anti-colonial Africa built on pride, not permission. Where the old model saw African governments managing poverty under the supervision of international partners, this new model imagined governments orchestrating development by and for their people. The ripple effect extended to cultural spaces as well. Music, film, and literature began embracing sovereignty as theme, not subtext. Social media trends shifted. Hashtag our gold, our future, and hashtag build. Burkina trended in Francophone Africa. Even memes carried weight, mocking Western outrage with humor sharp as iron. This shift wasn't lost on the youth. In a continent where the median age is 19, it is the young who bear the weight of policy failures and the hope of policy transformation. And they were watching, not just the headlines, but the ground-level results. They saw that canceling foreign military accords didn't bring more violence, it brought more accountability. They saw that demanding technology transfer didn't scare away all investors, it attracted new partners. They saw that declaring enough was not reckless, it was necessary. And in that seeing, something irreversible occurred. Belief. Belief that African problems require African solutions, not imported templates. Belief that independence is not a memory, but a mandate. Belief that leadership means serving the people, not mediating between them and external powers. But belief alone is not enough. The path ahead remains treacherous. The pushback has only begun. Financial pressure, diplomatic isolation, and information warfare are tools long perfected by external powers defending their interests. Still, for the first time in generations, Africa is not asking if sovereignty is possible. It is asking what comes next once it's claimed. Could this be Africa's long-awaited second independence? Outside Africa, confusion reigned. Western chancelleries struggled to reconcile the surge of sovereign rhetoric with their decades-old playbook for African engagement. To them, coups belonged to the past, relics of Cold War power struggles to be condemned swiftly and universally. But what if this time, the old formulas no longer applied? The African Union initially issued statements echoing protocol, rejecting unconstitutional changes of government, calling for a return to democratic order. ECOWAS went further, threatening sanctions and suspensions. But beneath the formal condemnations, cracks appeared. Burkina Faso's leadership pushed back, not with defiance, but with questions. Where was ECOWAS when schools lacked chalk and children lacked food? Where was the African Union when external actors flew military drones over African cities without clearance? Why had elections become rituals that changed faces but not systems? These weren't rhetorical flourishes. They were indictments of a continental architecture often more concerned with appearances than with justice. Internationally, the West took the familiar route. The United States issued concern over malign influence, warning of external actors exploiting instability. France, more personally implicated, responded with wounded pride, withdrawing ambassadors, cutting aid, and denouncing the Russian footprint. Indeed, Moscow's presence grew more visible. Russian flags appeared in demonstrations. Media highlighted security cooperation, agricultural deals, and promises of non-interference. China, by contrast, observed quietly, continuing infrastructure projects and offering trade incentives without public commentary. Beijing's strategy, as always, was long-term patience, but the loudest noise came from Western media, and not from what they said, but from what they did not. In article after article, Traoré was labeled a Putin proxy, a populist, a radical nationalist. Rarely was his policy platform discussed in detail. His demands for local gold processing, for technology transfer, for fair trade, were drowned in geopolitical noise. Even when public support was overwhelming, surveys were dismissed as unverified. When protests favored sovereignty, they were orchestrated. When opposition to Western presence was vocal, it was blamed on disinformation. In this framing, African agency was rendered invisible or illegitimate. But not everyone accepted the narrative. A growing chorus of scholars, journalists, and civil society voices challenged this portrayal. They pointed to the double standard. How could the West claim to champion democracy while backing regimes that crushed dissent but served economic interests? How could sovereignty be suspicious only when it threatened foreign profits? The lens matters. What the West calls instability, others see as African sovereignty. In Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and among the diaspora, solidarity grew, not with coups as a method, but with the substance of the message. Africa has the right to choose its path, even if that path rejects old alliances. The world is watching, but which version of Africa are they seeing? What if the rest of the world is watching Africa through the wrong mirror? The road ahead is neither paved nor marked. It twists through valleys of uncertainty and climbs peaks of possibility. But for the first time in a generation, Africa is not being pushed down this road. It is choosing to walk it. Two futures lie before Burkina Faso, and by extension, the continent. One is retribution. The old system recoils. Sanctions tighten. Investment dries up. Political isolation turns to economic strangulation. Information warfare intensifies, painting all dissent as danger. In this version, sovereignty is punished, not because it fails, but because it dares. The other future is resilience, a coordinated push for economic self-reliance, expansion of South-South cooperation, strengthening of regional trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area, strategic partnerships with nations that offer respect, not control, and crucially, an African narrative told by African voices. The youth stand at the center of this crossroads. They are not merely spectators, they are the cartographers of the new map. Through social media, they bypass old gatekeepers. Through entrepreneurship, they build outside rigid colonial frameworks. Through civic engagement, they demand institutions that serve, not mimic, foreign models. They understand the stakes. They know that processing gold domestically is not a technical decision. It is a declaration that replacing imported wheat with local sorghum is not about taste, it's about sovereignty. That expelling foreign troops is not isolationism. It is dignity reclaimed. But idealism alone won't be enough. The success of this path depends on capacity, the ability to translate slogans into policy, protest into governance, symbolism into systems. It requires investment, not just financial, but emotional. A collective decision to weather short-term pain for long-term gain. And above all, it demands unity, because the continent's strength lies not only in its resources, but in its reach. A market of over 1.4 billion, connected by language, by trade, by struggle, and by the unbreakable thread of shared purpose. It's not just about resisting the old world, it's about building the new one, with African blueprints, African bricks, and African hands. But can this seed of revolution grow without being scorched? It was never about the uniforms. It was never about the flags. It was always about the hands, the African hands, that dig, build, feed, and write. The fear gripping Western boardrooms and foreign ministries today does not come from weapons. It comes from questions. What if Africa stops exporting its wealth and starts investing it? What if African leaders stop asking how to comply and begin asking how to compete? What if anti-colonial Africa is not a chapter of history, but the title of the next one? Ibrahim Traoré may wear fatigues, but his fight is not with bullets. It's with paradigms. He stands in the lineage of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah, not just for what he says, but for what he attempts. To govern with African interests as the starting point, not the afterthought. Across the continent, others are watching. Not just presidents, teachers, drivers, traders, youth with smartphones and old souls. They see the stakes clearly. Political independence without economic control was a mirage. Sovereignty without ownership is theater. And so they ask, how do we finish what our ancestors began? The answer is not simple, but it begins with the courage to imagine. Imagine a continent where copper is refined in Congo, cocoa in Ghana, lithium in Zimbabwe, not in distant factories behind invisible borders. Imagine African universities as engines of innovation, African cities as centers of value creation, African stories told without translation, because they are told firsthand. This is not fantasy. It is a choice, a long, difficult, necessary choice. The world has seen revolutions before, but none like the rise of an anti-colonial Africa. An anti-colonial Africa does not ask to be saved. It asks to be heard. And when it speaks, it does not echo. It declares, that voice, rising in unison, is what true African sovereignty sounds like. If this vision stirs your conscience, don't just watch history unfold. Subscribe, speak, and stand with the future Africa is choosing.